we've passed a reasonable amount of people have joined. So now we have our excuse to get rolling. So thanks everyone for joining this Placer AI webinar, Office and Migration Update. Really excited to be talking about this topic. It's one we've been delving into more and more in recent months, but especially excited to be talking about it, not just because I love the topic, but because I love the people I'm joined by. So thrilled to be joined by Brett Swango, Head of Workforce Analytics at Colliers International. Brett, thanks so much for joining.
Excited to be here, Ethan.
I feel like you're one of the people who really had a huge influence on the fact that I was like, what do we have to do with Office and this kind of stuff? And I give you a lot of credit for showing us the light. And Stefan Martinovich, the VP of Partnerships at Placer AI. Stefan, thank you for joining.
My pleasure, Ethan. Good to be here.
Stefan, has the joy of being one of the third ever webinar guest, and we loved each other so much he had to join the company. That's not the real story, but I'm going to pretend it is. So, quick introduction to Placer for those of you who are unfamiliar. Placer is a location data company. What that means in its simplest form is people vote with their feet. We show you how they vote across the country every single day. We do that by observing a panel of over 30 million devices. Very critically, this is all anonymized aggregate data, so we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms to understand foot traffic patterns across the United States. And we present that in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from customer journeys, cross-shopping, migration patterns, trade areas, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested and less familiar with Placer, we have a free version of our premium product available at placer.ai. We also have a wonderful section called The Square on our website, which is the home to our free tools, which you can check out at placer.ai-the-square. But now to the topic at hand. Let's start with one of my favorite topics, which is migration patterns and migration and shifts in those patterns compared to what we had seen in the past. And Brett, I will start with you here. And it's whether there are two schools of thought, and I think there's clearly one that's more right, but two schools of thought. One, the pandemic just accelerated trends that already existed. Another is that it actually created new migration patterns and trends within that space. But however you kind of choose to see it, a lot of people are living in different places than they did before, and the pandemic had an impact on that. How big of an impact do you think it had now, several years removed from the onset of the pandemic?
Obviously significant. There's some demographic, and you and I have talked about this in prior webinars. There's some demographic drivers. So I'm 32, born in 1990. So I'm both right in the middle of the largest cohort of the workforce, which is the millennials. And I'm also the mode. So essentially the most millennials were born in 1990. So essentially think of it as a bubble, right? And I was right in the top of it. So when the pandemic hit was right before my 30th birthday. And if you look at the average age of and I'll probably miss these plus or minus a year, average age of a college educated woman when she has her first kid, I believe is 29. Average age of a male when he has a kid period is 31. So essentially, again, right at the kind of the top of that pyramid. So again, the most millennials and the bulk of the millennials are the middle of that millennial cohort were turning, right in that 30-ish range, that childbearing range. And obviously we know that also that number's a little bit later for the further you're, the more educated, i.e. the more likely you are to live in a dense urban metro. So COVID hit right at the right time for a lot of that segment of the population to say, okay, now's the time. The value proposition of the city, which if you look at the number one reason why people live in cities, it really are young people. It boils a lot down to transportation and essentially that proximity to their friends and to nightlife and to events and to experience. Well, that value proposition got eroded because of COVID. So, okay, the value proposition's gone. The cost is all there. So that cost benefit analysis no longer makes sense for me to stay in that dense urban metro. I was in Chicago. My best friend was in New York. We were both single. We did our own site selection exercise, water, weather, taxes, and we ultimately, and what's open, we ultimately landed in Tampa, Florida. And I think the first time you and I did the analysis a year after COVID, number one growth market on a percentage basis, Tampa, Florida. So a lot of people were doing that same kind of calculus in the growth of these Sunbelt cities. So did it exacerbate a trend that was already happening with the move to the burbs? Yes, it pushed that forward. Did it accelerate a trend of people to the high quality of life, lower cost of living, more business friendly environments? It absolutely did. Remote work was already becoming an increasing segment of the population, but it was very small. If you looked at where what were one of our theses early on, and if you remember from that webinar, we kind of went through kind of that scorecard, that red, yellow, green of what are the drivers of the markets that are going to do disproportionately well throughout COVID. One of those was even though remote workers was a small portion of the population pre-COVID, it was where did those people live? Because these people can live anywhere. So where do the people who can live anywhere, where do they live? Those are likely going to be the places that disproportionately grow when that segment of the population who can live and work from anywhere grows.
Kind of like the canary in the migration coal mine, so to speak.
Exactly. As you know, it's not just about data, it's about what are the variables, or what are the critical variables that you should be using from that data to inform that thesis. And I think that was a big one. And then also, okay, so what workers can go anywhere? That was also a big predictor, because on average, cities have a disproportionate volume of white collar workers. White collar workers have a disproportionate capability. There's been a few different academic studies that have analyzed this to work from home effectively. Okay, well, now this segment of the population who can work from home effectively, they can go anywhere they want. Where are they going to go? They're probably not going to stay in those cities.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point. And I think, Stefan, looking to you there, I think, we talk a lot about these migration patterns, and we're going to dive in deeper to those drivers that kind of Brett was just discussing. But is there a lesson for like businesses, especially those for kind of retail and real estate within those kind of focus areas? And when you see changes like this, how do you leverage them to your advantage? Because, if you're in the core of a major city, obviously this isn't the greatest thing that ever happened to you. For many other businesses, there are ways to turn this into a very powerful opportunity.
Well, I guess there's a couple sides of the coin. So I think that if you're seeing like socio-demographic change in regions, like the more velocity that those trends have, the more market opportunity is going to get created. Now, you tend to see a lot of the trends that Brett mentioned, and we're looking at here on the chart, like a large percentage increase, of people that are probably a bit more affluent in more cases because they're more economically mobile. And that's driving new demand entirely, right? And those places are where you have an availability of housing supply, a lot of which is being newly constructed. So where we talk about business friendly markets, that it certainly extends into housing policy as well. And where you have an ability to actually develop higher concentrations of housing, like in Texas and Arizona and Utah, where there is available land. It draws in by its very nature hundreds, thousands of new population that want to access that area's resources, and may have newfound employment flexibility. So I think as retailers are moving in, if there's a plan to move in and let's say 1,000 new residents, then they're going to have corresponding demand across a whole bunch of different retail categories, right? And you're pretty much starting greenfield in that case, with the exception of maybe pre-leased anchor tenants, that sort of thing. So, it's about kind of obviously understanding the demographic that's moving in there, what are their preferences? How is that maybe different from the preferences of, the existing population base? It could be totally different. I mean, we're seeing this in a lot of areas around the country, right? In the, throughout the Northeast, you're seeing, just to Brett's point, concentrations of, let's say, millennials, young families moving. Those are the people that are moving out to the suburbs, and they're displacing, baby boomers, empty nesters, and people that no longer have a need for a big house, right? Mm-hmm. So, that's happening all the time. So even in areas where you're not seeing a gross increase in migration, understanding the dynamics of, what the demographics of those folks are is really important, because you've got a need to cater, different brands and retailers in the market position themselves obviously towards different customer segments. And if you have a retail environment that's lagging behind, in the retail mix in terms of the population who's actually now there, there's a good opportunity for other new retailers to come in and potentially reinvigorate some of those communities, mm-hmm. even drive rents really for commercial real estate, if there is, untapped demand that they can in fact serve.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it also speaks to, there's this idea of we looked at and I think, we did some research at one point, and one of the things that we found was there's certain retailers who saw their audience get much younger. And a big part of that was this push to the suburbs. And I think so some cases, the first time demand, so to speak, was actually coming to the retailers. In other cases, they needed to think about, hey, do I really belong in this place anymore? Because my core audience is moving away. But I do think a big part of that comes to kind of the drivers of these shifts. And Brett, you were talking about this quite a bit. And, so maybe like I'll shift the question slightly, but, because we've spoken about this, Stefan, for you, if you had to look at like, what is kind of, I know there's not one, but which driver of these migration patterns do you think has the longest staying power?
I mean, look, I think that a lot of the factors that, Brett mentioned, I think he's right on. I mean, it comes in the research that I've done and the data that I see, which is quite a bit. I mean, a lot of it, it comes down to weather, cost of living, quality of life. It's really like those are the three big things that drive a lot of these sorts of decisions. I mean, there are secondary reasons, right? Like, moving closer to family, other things like that are personal that like might influence someone's decisions. But, in terms of, people that have like, flexibility and economic choice to like, go and choose a new geography and to bring their work with them or to find employment there, which is, look, that's one of the, probably the number one thing that people will move for is, consideration of all of those aspects, but also like, obviously, where can they find employment that will provide them the quality of life, right? And everything is all relative, right? There's no single place that's perfect. There's all these trade-offs. But, like, I think that's, predominantly what is pushing people towards a lot of these areas, right? Like, Arizona, like we just talked about, there's more housing supply, the weather's good, the taxes are low, and it's growing. The economy's growing, right? So like, there's a lot of logic, and the question is like, when does a place kind of develop like a critical mass and, becomes its own center of gravity, right? Because if you've got a really small metro that may not be differentiated that well, you've got more of an uphill climb, right? Whereas, let's just take Nashville as an example. It's just seen a huge amount of growth. I mean, it's got a tremendous tourist base, so there's more people coming through there, seeing the city, experiencing it, getting to know the culture, big institutions, nightlife, great airport, right? There's all sorts of things that like people experience. They generally go there before they try to move there to get a feel for it. So and there's a scene, right? There's a music scene, there's an industry, there's a core industry there, which is really driving a lot of that, right? So, places are changing in their dynamic, right? Like, where I live up here in the Hudson Valley, I mean, IBM is opening a huge new facility to produce, silicon-based chips and things like that, with a lot of public investment. Like when you have, 1,000 new jobs get created, plus the ripple effect that like goes along with that, there's going to be economic opportunity that people even within the region will then gravitate towards in order to like, distribute some of those economic shifts within here.
That's a great point. Brett, from your perspective, you also kind of touched on a bunch of these drivers. For you, which of these do you think is going to have the longest term effect?
Human capital. That was one that we probably kind of left out of that mix. I think Stefan brought up two great points there that I left out. Well, like so Nashville and Austin, right? Those are the two easy darlings to be like, wow, those two markets took off. Again, it was I'll call it like quality of life, weather. It was zero income tax states, strong academic institutions, culture, right? Both of them are kind of known for their like live music scene. And Stefan brought up a phenomenal point is what is your lever to attract people to visit your area, right? And so I think that's where that, whether it's Austin City Limits or, CMA Fest or one of these things that's going to draw people to your area to visit. And then all of a sudden you can work remotely. It's like, wait a minute, I can turn this vacation into the place that I live. And now I live on vacation. I think there's another huge paradigm shift. I mean, if you just look at like geopolitically, like where we're shifting more European, right? I mean, I'm talking to friends who work in the big four, who their Gen Z group that they're hiring, they're essentially saying, and again, given the dynamics of the labor market, which I think we're in a perpetual labor shortage from now on. Obviously, if the bottom falls out of the economy, there will be slack in the labor market in the short term. but whatever the number is, roughly 300,000 less people are turning 18 each year than were 10 years ago. Again, when you were dealing with that bubble the height of that lump of the millennials. So there's a different time versus money trade-off. And again, if you look at I would highly encourage those who haven't, read Jeff Bezos' 2021 letter to shareholders. Basically, the whole message is how much time he's saving people and how relative to the cost of a Prime subscription, the time that he's saving people, it's a no-brainer in value because there's this time versus money trade-off. And I think that there's a very different demographic lens on what I'll call it the economics of that trade-off. So the reason I say all that is quality of life really is going to obviously continue to trump all. And then the other one is human capital. So if you are an area that is continually proliferating human capital, because that's there's a nonlinear or ecosystem, I'm blanking on the word, but there's a compounding effect, right? There's a reason that, if you look at the two highest IQ industries out there, you got life science in the Boston, Cambridge area. You've got, technology talent in Palo Alto. It's that integration of the community, the college, and the companies in that area. And that ecosystem, it's very nonlinear, right? So the areas that do it a little bit better are going to have disproportionate economic prosperity. So I think the better job that communities and companies and colleges can do, and we call them the 3 C's, working together, those areas are going to continue to prosper. And ultimately, I think technology inherently puts disproportionate value on human capital versus, I'll call it even financial capital relative to historic trends.
I mean, it's a really important point. I do think the emphasis on the academic institutions is really important, because if you can get that situation where, why do people why is New York and New York universities, they get such a disproportionate amount of applicants? It's because of the ability to go there, to be in that city, and then to stay there. And if you can create that same sort of buzz around this, especially if there's virtual works, you're not as limited in terms of the types of career you can have post. If you can give if a place has both those institutions and a high quality of life afterwards, plus those draws that you're discussing, it's a really exciting opportunity. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about office here, especially based on what you were just saying, Brett. And I'll start with you here. I mean, we have clearly seen a recovery for offices from the depths of it, but it hasn't been as, at least for me, what I expected was kind of straight up and linear, and it hasn't been that. It's been a little bit rockier, and there's points that it plateaus. And I mean, but at the same time, there's crazy amounts of volatility, and there's so many confounding factors. And so how do you make sense of the space with the lens of when are we going to understand when things are normal?
I think this, this is the new normal. The terminology I've seen used by some is that we're in a polycrisis right now. Essentially what's happening between the geopolitical, the demographic, I'll call it the political disconnect in the two parties right now across the United States, as well as I think the disruption that technology is driving. I would say that this level of uncertainty, and even if you look at one of the things that I try to solve for is, we're in the commercial real estate business, right? So what do? We help companies, buy, sell, lease real estate. So who's our core client? It's CEOs, right? It really, obviously it filters down through the real estate department, but what do CEOs care most about right now? And it was all about labor and supply chains. And now it's still about labor and supply chains, but they're kind of trumped by uncertainty and inflation. Well, inflation, that's a little bit of a tough one for, I think, any of us probably on the call to do a lot about. But uncertainty, what does that mean? That means increasing, or, what we say is, how do you make more data-driven decisions? Because 1, it increases the probability of being right. 2, it decreases the probability that you'll get fired if you're wrong, because you've essentially garnered kind of alignment across the organization that these were the metrics that mattered, and here's the data points we're using to inform our decision. And the third one is that it increases, I'll call it the organizational evolution, because you say, hey, even if we were wrong, why did we miss it? And what are the new data points we should be incorporating in our next analysis to inform that thesis? So that's a really long-winded way of saying that while the office has been hit, I don't expect it to recover dramatically in the immediate term, because again, that value proposition is kind of gone. It's like the cat's out of the bag regarding the ability for people to effectively work from home. And so what we're talking a lot of with our clients about right now is the two M's. And is office a mandate or is it a magnet? And how do you make it the latter? Right. And I think that in the other piece that kind of goes back to my prior conversation of how do you build the human capital? Well, there's a trove of information available on the internet. So in theory, you could argue, and all of these, the ability to build communities, even if you look at, again, looking at Gen Z and their experience with video games and the percentage of what they consider their really close friends that they've never even met in person, right? There's a whole, I know it's a big topic to unpack, but what does community mean? And how do you be intentional about how you proliferate that and how you proliferate it in person? And how do you create an ecosystem within that office that really enhances the human capital of your organization to where people feel like, hey, I need to be in the office because that's where that's going to accelerate my development and help me become my best self faster. So that's the way that we think about office. And that's why I think that the Class A and the really but it needs to be well located, right? Because again, people just think about this, right? A 1 hour commute, which I did for the first 4 or 5 years, living downtown Chicago, commuting to the northern burbs. I was looking at, about an hour each way if you left, even remotely close to peak traffic. Well, that's 1 hour a day or 1 hour each way is 2 hours a day, 10 hours a week. You're working a 40-hour work week. Let's say you work 40 years. You've spent 10 years in traffic. So like the value proposition of what does the office have to be in order to justify that tax that it's charging on my life and my most valuable asset, that's time, is very, very different. So increasing the proximity to your employee pool has never been more important than it is today. And I think, again, the well-located assets, and if you look across the various cities, those are the assets that are doing well, right? Like, why does New York work? It's like, hey, if you're living in a really dense part of the city, you probably have a really small apartment. Well, that apartment is probably not meant to be a place where you spend 24 hours a day. It's probably meant for you to kind of eat and sleep, right? So a lot to chew on there, but it's a topic that you could probably spend an hour on.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I mean, Stefan, it's interesting because we looked at this as like, well, one of the things that is driving people to certain areas is places where it's easier for them to do business and like there are lower costs of doing business. And that was a driver. But I think, I wonder from your perspective, we hear all these problems that Brett brings up. And I think, we would agree that those are really significant challenges and obstacles. But, this idea that the office is a magnet, there are levers that the office has to pull in order to be a more central piece of the professional puzzle. For you, what are those key levers that can be pulled and, how to utilize them effectively?
I agree with everything Brett said. And, I guess the way I would synopsize it is that, real estate in the location world is finally being held accountable for placemaking, right? It's that like, you could force people to a dreary office park in the middle of nowhere if that was the source of their employment, but it didn't mean that that was somewhere that they actually wanted to be, right? You look at what Salesforce is doing, where they like just built a resort instead of like investing more in the office, and they're just getting people out there to like mix and mingle and collaborate and have mind share with their employees in that way, right? Now, like two totally different ends of the spectrum, but like, the time aspect of it is really everything. Like nobody wants to, I think that like we can unilaterally say that nobody likes to commute or really likes to commute. And the amount of time that it takes most people to commute is a almost unconscionable percentage of their life when you really break it down. And what is it worth, right? And it's just like it's almost irreplaceable when like you not only get that time back, but like you can see your kids more if that was something you were interested in doing. And like it totally changes the dynamic of how people live, right? And exposed that in a way that I think was not possible through almost any other circumstance. I almost think I think of like that from the movie The Red October, where like how do you get people to want to get off a nuclear submarine? Like Frank, what we've done here is we've kind of like forced them into like a new way of thinking that like has changed their perception about like where they want to be and when, right? And that is just it's something that like has been I don't know if it's ever been seen in the modern era for any particular reason. Now, what you're showing here, goes back to the same themes that we discussed earlier, whereas, cost of doing business, I think is a good way of capturing, more broadly, but such a huge driver of, and reflection of the cost of doing business is real estate, housing, and everything related to it, which is a massive proportion of the economy, right? Especially in some places more than others, right? And depending on what, sort of environment the location is, it's going to, prompt and welcome new development. And by virtue of that, new housing supply, where if you don't have new housing supply, you're not going to see big net increases in population. It's as simple as that, right? So like, the proxy of cost of doing business really means, I think less regulation, just kind of like more broadly, right? Like easier permitting processes, like cheaper hourly rates for professional service, like everything that like you would need in effectuating some sort of business transaction in that location, right? Which generally requires a premises and some sort of capital expenditure, right? So, it's this cost of doing business aspect. And then you layer on what a lot of our customers are doing at Placer with this is, identifying the best ways to deploy incentives, right? Like how can we attract new businesses to start or relocate in our location, right? And it comes down to showing off like, all of the various resources and capabilities and the talent pool, really is, numero uno, but also what kind of talent can you attract? Right now, it may not necessarily be, reflected in some of the other numbers, but from what I've seen, in addition to places where you have, looser regulations around, new housing construction, you've also, you have markets which are tightly constrained, which are also seeing massive migration and, increases on a net basis, which are like wealthy vacation markets, basically. Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Sun Valley, Idaho, Park City, all these places, right? Because here you have people that absolutely have economic flexibility. They've been to these places, certainly. They may already have homes there. So even though there's no supply being built, you're just going from a year-round occupancy of, let's say, 50% to a year-round occupancy of 70%. That is a massive shift in the local economy and the labor demand and the revenue potential and how you think about property taxes. It's massive.
Especially in those areas where people have disposable income. I mean, it's not.
Oh my God,
you're
yeah.
Talking about areas where
people disposable income.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's a really important point. I want to shift now our focus a little bit, looking ahead towards 23, and I'll use the question that came in as kind of a segue into the next question, which is looking at migration patterns moving forward. It was asked, do existing demographics of cities affect the migration to Sunbelt / or a place like Boise, Idaho, for example? Would people want to live in a place that does not have as much diversity as the Northeast? I think the answer is yes. Like if you look at least our migration data shows a very clear shift to places like Montana, Idaho, though not only. Like it's a combination of factors, and I don't think it's as simple as places with. I think diversity is places with less diversity is not a blocker, but there must be other things that are creating that draw. I think with that to lead in, and Brett, I'll start with you here. We are seeing that the migration patterns are starting to level off. So they're not as intense as they were. From your perspective, have we seen the places that won, did they win long-term? The places that lost, did they lose long-term? Is this normal? Is Tampa Bay just now a force to be reckoned with and San Francisco not quite what it was?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer your last point first, I'll go back to your last question. So the question of diversity, I think that begs the question of what does diversity mean to you, right? Because are we talking about socioeconomic? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about race, right? Because there's an easy brush. And I mean, if I was betting, I would think that there's going to be a lot more talk about socioeconomic diversity going forward, because whether you're, black, white, yellow, green, if there's probably, you probably have a lot more similar social tendencies predicated based on your socioeconomic status than based on your at least the data that I've looked at would suggest based on your racial status. So that's like a piece that if you're looking forward and saying, what is the definition of diversity and how's that going to change in the future? That's one I would keep an eye on. To answer your question, I think, yes, the cities who have won are going to continue to do well. Again, what is changing in the world? Demographics, right? That segment, you and I covered this, 25 to 34, more than twice as likely on a per capita basis to be mobile, right? To move. Well, that pool is now shrinking, right? Because that hump of the millennials are moving out of that segment. So that would be a driver that says, okay, population migration is going to slow. Interest rates, right? Who wants to trade out of a 3% mortgage into a 7% mortgage? Guess what your payment is, just super high level math on a 30-year mortgage at 3% versus 7%. Your payment went from $1,600 a month to $2,600 a month. So essentially your purchasing power on an asset, just, you can move into a house that costs 40% lower, right? Or that costs 40% less, right? So all of a sudden the bar that a market has to clear from a cost of living perspective in order to have that same value gets quite a bit higher. I think the cost differential across the country, when they look at the studies I've seen, is that the greatest corollary with basically multifamily or single family home rental growth is cost of living, right? Well, what you're seeing now is like a greater squeeze in that spread across, especially the high quality of life markets across the country. Another interesting point I think you brought up before of, hey, these people are now living in these vacation cities. Well, again, if their time matters more than ever, and also if you look at the income or the wealth gap in the country, that's continuing to widen. So I would argue that top end of that wealth pool is putting even a disproportionate value on their time and on their quality of life. So you're going to see a non-linear benefit of those most high-end locations, because the segment of the population who's in those super high-end locations has a disproportionate kind of, I'll call it key points to chew on.
Yeah, I think we lost you for a beat of that, but I don't want to give away that was a trade secret, so that's why we purposefully
Exactly.
No, it's an important point, and I mean, Stefan, I wonder your thoughts on the same thing. Is this the new normal? I say this on every webinar because I use it on every webinar. I hate that term so much, but I use it all the time. But is this kind of normalcy now?
I think that the velocity obviously is it's slowing, and that's fine, because I think people that wanted, an adjustment to quality of life, had enough, a change of life status, had an opportunity to do it, that's kind of tapered off at this point. People that wanted to do that have done it. It's been 2 years. Now, these places, for the same reasons that we're talking about, it's the same policy environment, right? So you're going to continue to see new housing construction. And I think that a lot of, to Brett's point about socioeconomic diversity, I mean, I think in-migration actually prompts the opportunity for more diversity, right? Because there's no restriction about where you can move from, or who you are to come into this market. It's right, who is that area attracting, right? I don't think people position commercial properties or build subdivisions to necessarily attract one gender or one I don't know, some other status, right? I don't think that really happens, or it shouldn't under housing law. And so just the creation of new places to live, I think brings in, has the potential to bring in people from all over. And if we're talking about areas where there's a high concentration of some socioeconomic or ethnic group, then more people in could only make it more diverse, right? So think about it through that lens. I think that where there are, there's more stratification by socioeconomics and purchasing power than anything else, without a doubt, right? With purchasing power going down right now, I think the housing market is just it's kind of just cooling, unless you're a cash buyer, in which case this is a feast. But more broadly, people that are taking out mortgages, it's just going to put a chill on stuff for a while. Okay, that's fine. But I think that look, there's still going to be some people always that have a reason to move. Maybe they just won't buy. maybe some of that inventory will get put into single family rentals, which is obviously super hot. And it's probably going to see even more demand when people see that purchasing power eroded if they're moving to, especially if they're moving to a new place, right? Like, yes, rents have increased. And to Brett's point, there's like definitely a compression between, your gateway markets and then your kind of secondary and tertiary markets. And the way that I would think about this is just going to be more emerging secondary markets is what it is, right? It used to be your list of secondary markets or primary was, Boston, LA, New York, San Francisco. Like secondary is maybe Miami, right? Well, there's just now more markets on that list, because they've just seen large enough population increases to be considered for, the equivalent of that S&P 500, right? So, for that reason, I think that they've garnered enough attention where institutional interest is now definitely there, and it's increased in a big way. And that's leading to much more in the way of capital flows and investment into these places, which is, going to continue that cycle. Now, the challenge that I see some of these areas facing is there's a continued risk of natural disasters. It's going to be, regardless of what condition the housing market is in, it's going to be impossible to get insurance, and by virtue of that, a mortgage. So that's something that's got to be figured out, because right now, we're seeing whiffs of impacts and damage to property as a result of obviously, natural disasters and stuff. And, figuring out what is the long-term solution, from the finance and, risk management side of, the lending business is going to be crucial in order to really sustaining that growth. Maybe you could say the same about some other infrastructure and things like that in Texas and Arizona and otherwise. Like, do they have the capacity to support this? And or when does stuff start to hit their limit? In what financial condition will these locations be in when it comes time to pay the bill on fixing water mains and stuff like that? That's when quality of life starts to get measured kind of over that longer multi-year period.
Interesting. I think, a question came in about, because we've seen this a lot. Are folks leaving places that are politically undiverse for places that there's a more, for political reasons? I think the answer, the thesis we have currently is maybe, I'm sure there are people, but the bigger things are cost of living, quality of life, even the cost of moving. Brett, you were the one who originally kind of shared this data with me. It's expensive to move. It's really expensive to move, and it's expensive to move farther away. And so it's a cost benefit calculation, and so much less than a political one, at least what we're seeing in the data thus far. Could it be? Possibly, but the clearer thing is much more economic. I want to go, and we'll do that. Let's do this one kind of rapidly. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I pile on one right there? Because I would say, if I had to say one thing that's changed the most in the corporate site selection process over the last 3 years, it is understanding the political environment that these companies are moving into. And so ultimately, if it all really does come down to jobs and education, at least one of those variables is saying, hey, we really care about the political environment. And also, if you look at the states that are losing people and how those states and specifically those cities have historically voted, and what those historical votes have done to the cost of doing business and or the crime rates and or the business friendliness of those markets and what have driven those people out of there, I think that's the thing that I would be watching. And not, all investors are. Everybody is thinking about what is the political, but how is that? If you look at the major, so Dallas and Houston, those are basically the last election, at least in 2020, they were roughly 50-50, well, almost exactly 50-50 red versus blue. So even in a state that is known historically for being very red, you're seeing some change there. And as that change happens, and as you see some political turnover there, you could see some of the same policies that have driven people out of Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Chicago start to play out in some of these other cities. It's a longer term trend to watch, obviously, but that's one to keep an eye on.
And sorry, I would just, on that too, if you go back to the business friendliness topic, right? The states that tend to be business friendly just tend to be, under more conservative policies and regimes, right? That is one of the, the pillars of, conservative policy in many ways. So I think that there's just kind of a natural, if you looked at it on a state, we look at it on a state by state basis, it's certainly going to appear that way. But I think, intrastate migration would certainly lend itself also to people moving more towards inner cities, places like that, where it's a bit more urbanized and tends to lean, maybe a little bit more left.
The last point I have to pile on, because I just heard this from an economist a couple of weeks ago, and it was a bit of an aha. But if you look at even what the Supreme Court has done recently in a lot of their rulings, there's and I don't, I'm not a political historian here, but they basically saying that the amount of power that state and local politics have now is at its greatest level in the last 100 or last 150 years, right? So, i.e., the criticality of being in a locale that aligns with your personal political beliefs is at an all-time high versus hey, you're in the United States, right? So I think that's another kind of component or another layer of complexity that probably further supports, Stefan's point there.
Well, you know what? I stand corrected because I didn't think it was such a big deal, and both of you do. By the way, not
on
a
one-off basis, it doesn't, right? But as you start to step back from the whole, I think there are some macro points there.
The macro point, by the way, the point is just, Stefan, you brought this up about like where things are more expensive to do business. That is, and the alignment with kind of certain types of politics is a big one. I think there is a rush to the narrative that I think is slightly problematic, or in terms of it, but it's business friendliness, it's economic friendliness, as opposed to, let's call it, more hot topic political issues. But interesting, and you've heard a diverse array of perspectives. But we are running almost done. So super quick. Each of you get 1 minute to tell me about a region in the country that you are particularly excited by and why. Stefan, let's start with you.
Great Lakes. I think that, like, and really kind of the Rust Belt a little bit more broadly. I mean, I think that, for a lot of the reasons we've been talking about, I think weather is going to start to, climate will change, and weather, I think, will start to become a little bit of a looser factor once people start to have 120-degree days in Arizona. I just think it's going to like, all right, well, there is a downside to this other than just being sunny every day. And I think that cities that have, built-in infrastructure that has slack in them, I think will ultimately benefit. You look at Pittsburgh, you look at Buffalo, there is room to build housing. There is a desire to bring in businesses and to bring in new residents. The micro trends favor some of these places in many ways. And when we talk about educational institutions, things like that, they are there in these places. Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh. There's a lot of different draws to some of these places that have been heavily invested in many decades over the last couple centuries, and may have hit their peak in the economic cycle maybe in the early to mid let's say the mid 1900s, but now are starting to see a bit of a resurgence there. So, and the cost of living is very low, right?
Yeah.
Taxes may be higher, but generally, on a local basis, they're low, and cost of living is low.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot of people say Pittsburgh and Buffalo. So Stefan, definitely major points for not going down the beaten track.
Outside the box. There we go.
Brett, same question for you. Area that you love and why?
100. If you're making a 100-year bet, very strongly agree with Stefan's take there. The Great Lakes are maybe the best. They may be the best position from a natural disaster, access to fresh water, perspective, and also ability, infrastructure and ability to support population growth of almost anywhere in the world. So really like there. But otherwise, I would say, I think I'll call it almost a pseudo trend to watch is this dual location play. Even, again, I grew up in a small town in central Illinois, right? So thinking about where does the future stand for me, I could never see myself raising a family in Chicago, but I lived in Tampa, liked it there, high quality of life. Guess what time of year is not so great to be there? Summer. Well, what if you had kids lived in Tampa, benefited from the low cost of living, low tax environment? You essentially flip that savings from a tax perspective into either a vacation home or even renting a place, whether that's close to my parents or in a major metro further north. The economics of that can actually make sense. So that would be kind of I'll go take it a little bit of a different way and say that's a trend I would watch. I do also, just from a job growth perspective, with the growth in manufacturing and onshoring, look at where the engineering talent and the technical talent for that space is across the country. The Big Ten, the Midwest is pretty well positioned. Also, I love that Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee. That's that we see a lot of growth in. And if you had to have me pick a city and just saying, hey, what city has a lot of the characteristics that I like relative to what I've seen in Nashville, Austin, et cetera, Knoxville, Tennessee would be my pick there. Doesn't have the airport, but there's a lot of other characteristics that I'm very bullish on Knoxville.
That's a great point about that area is obviously really, really exciting. Unfortunately, we have to close up because we are at time. We've gotten amazing questions that we haven't been able to answer. So please send those in. And also, you can always send in questions. We've had some people sending questions before a webinar, and then we're able to actually build it into the conversation. So please feel free to do that. I'm at ethan@placer.ai, so feel free to shoot those over. The recording will be available by tomorrow morning EST. For those of you who are interested, our next webinar is in just a few weeks. We're going to be doing our shopping center myths and facts with our good friends Alana Loeffler and David Spahn. So please make sure to join us then. But most importantly, thank you so much, Brett and Stefan, for joining today. This was a really enjoyable and not surprisingly, but an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Loved
Feel
it.
free to reach out direct if there's anything else, but always an intriguing dialogue with you guys.
Amazing.
Same
Thanks so
here.
much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Great.